Hi, I'm Matt the Comic Guy. Today I want to explain about something. Explain about something in comics that no one else has ever discovered. Today I want to explain about something in comics that's been interesting for years. Today I want to explain how a certain change had stopped being a thing led to something like this in comics. You don't know, I'm talking about something involved DC Comics and how they, along with Archie Comics, were the reason why for the removal and end of what was called the Comics Code Authority, and why Archie Comics was the one who finished the job that DC had made started. Well, not really, but they did. How the end of the Comics Code Authority had led to one of the most interesting / darkest things to happen in DC Comics. Now, when I say darkest things, I mean things that you normally would not have seen happen with DC Comics, well, this being involved. So, let's start with the history and how this happened. See, comics had existed years and years ago during a certain point of the 19th century. But there weren't issues about any specific characters. There was just pages and pages of different types of stories. That's not until years later that comic books started to become these stories about these superpowered beings and stuff like that. And one company that made it even more possible was National Publications, which was originally what was later will become DC Comics. Now, DC at the time had started this thanks to one comic, which was the very first issue of a series of comics that was pretty much an anthology series called Action Comics, and a debut of one character in this first issue of the series, Superman. The iconic cover, him lifting in the car, smashing it, and seeing these scared reactions of the couple of these criminals that were in the cover. Now, the comic was so famous that it had a lot of copies since then, and it was successful enough that DC can write other heroes. And the next hero debuted in the 27th issue of a comic series called The Comics, and that was Batman. Now, ever since then, DC pumped out more and more heroes. Jay Garrick, also known as The Flash, Diana Prince, also known as Wonder Woman, Alan Scott, also known as the Green Lantern, Arthur Curry, also known as Aquaman, and of course, who forgets the man with the bow and arrow himself, Green Arrow. After the success of the comic books, DC continued on using more ways of making these comic books very, very popular. But after the war ended, superheroes slowly stopped being a thing after a while. And the only surviving superheroes at the time were ones made by DC themselves, the trinity of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And after a while, I guess you can say the heroes lose their edge. And since then, a lot of comic books had focused on comedy, crime comics, and horror comics. And this is where the Comic Code Authority comes in. See, there was a man named Frederick Wolfram who made a book called Seduction of the Innocent. He supposed that one was kind of a fascist and Batman and Robin were kind of homosexuals. Which is kind of odd. Batman and Robin were never... I never imagined Batman and Robin as homosexuals. But anyways, his point still stands, and that made comic book companies realize they need to do something. And so, the Comic Code Authority was formed. And it took years and years and years for how strict this comic book company was. But ever since the start of the 70s, the Comic Code Authority had been more loose of what should and shouldn't be allowed. Ever since then, during the 70s and 80s, things got more darker and grittier thanks to the publications. Most regularly, DC Comics, with their most successful comics at this time, The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. Both successful comic books that led to DC continuing on the map. The time that the next couple of decades roll around, the Comics Code slowly stopped being involved. With DC themselves slowly get rid of the code with their own rating system in January of 2011. DC Comics slowly stopping the code a month after. Now, why I say this thing that slowly stopped this code of authority slowly changed over the time. Well, change over the time of what DC was and what they are currently with their most latest comics. See, it will start the fact that DC wanted to be a bit more interesting than how dark they can be with their certain stories. Ever since the code slowly disappeared, they started to use more stories to see how far they can go with the dark tone. But sometimes going forward with the dark tone doesn't mean a successful story. I will cover those type of comics much in a later video. I'm Matt the Comic Guy, and now time for the next video. Bye.